Okay, so today we're going to look at the Civil War, and we're going to talk about the border states and just some of the early battles in the war and how the war gets started and some of the impact of some of these early battles. So first off, we're going to look at the border states. And the border states, they are very important to the success of the Union of the United States against the Confederate States. And those states are made up of Delaware, you can see right there next to Maryland, and then also Kentucky and Missouri. Now, West Virginia is also, in a sense, a border state. It did not exist before the Civil War, though. West Virginia is made up of some of the western counties. You can see that West Virginia in red there in the map is made up of the western counties of what was originally all just Virginia. This portion of the state was loyal to the Union, didn't have a very large slave population, so there weren't a lot of slaveholders in this portion of Virginia, and so they remain loyal to the Union and separate from Virginia, and in 1863 actually are admitted as a separate state of West Virginia. So these Union state, or these border states, remain loyal to the Union, do not become part of the Confederacy, although that was definitely not certain that would happen. There was a lot of anxiety that these states would also join with the Union, and Lincoln and many others felt that this was vitally important to keep these states in here, and there's several reasons why. First, if you look at these states, all these border states, they have a very large population, especially Kentucky and Missouri. They both have over 1 million people in those states, and those states together, if you had to add up the population, the population of those states equaled almost half of the population of the 11 southern states that did secede. And so therefore, it would have greatly increased the size of the Confederate states as far as their population. But not only that, so that's one thing, but then Missouri and Kentucky in particular have huge amounts of livestock and grain production. So the food that another advantage, so two advantages we talked about the North had, one of them being population, other being food production. Kentucky and Missouri are a big part of that. They're not the only ones, certainly these other states, but they provide a lot of necessary food to fight this war. And so if they lose those, the South gains those, that's going to be a big loss for the South or for the North, and gain for the South. And then also, especially with Kentucky and Missouri, again, they have their key access to the rivers. The Ohio River is the northern border of Kentucky. That jagged border, that's the Ohio River, and that means as long as Kentucky remains, the Ohio River is completely in Union territory. And then you can see the Mississippi River is the eastern border of Missouri. And so that helps to ensure the northern half of the Mississippi River remains under Union control. And so that's really important. But not only that, in Kentucky, that gives them access to other rivers like the Cumberland River and some other large rivers that are in Kentucky that flow right into the heart of the South. And so rivers are great for moving people and moving troops and supplies, and so if they can keep access to these rivers, they've got a good chance of being able to invade deep into the South using these rivers. And then Maryland is important for some of those other reasons, especially the population, but also Washington, D.C. is bordered on three of Washington, D.C.'s, our nation's capital, borders basically are in Maryland. And so if Virginia has already seceded, if Maryland then secedes, Washington, D.C. is completely surrounded by the Confederacy and therefore would most likely have to be evacuated, and the United States would lose its capital. Not only would that be embarrassing, but it would just be difficult on the nation to adjust. They could do it, but it would certainly not be good for the country to lose the capital. And so those are some of the most important reasons why the United States really needed to keep this. And because of this, Abraham Lincoln adjusted his policies to try to better fit and therefore with the attitude of these border states and to not upset the border states. An example, during early in the battle, there's troops that are being moved to protect Washington, D.C., and they go through Baltimore to get there. They're headed to Baltimore. Well, during that time, these troops are attacked by those that are in the South, that are in Maryland, in Baltimore, that are loyal to the South and not to the Union. And instead of really dealing harshly with them, instead of the federal government dealing harshly with those people, Lincoln says, hey, we don't want to cause trouble there. Just avoid Baltimore. When you have to move troops, don't move them through that area to avoid causing any more, stirring up any more trouble. We don't want to stir up trouble. We want them to stay loyal to the Union, so avoid causing trouble there. And that was kind of the idea. That was the way they went about doing things. The Emancipation Proclamation, one of the things we talk about, it does not outlaw slavery anywhere but in the Confederate States. Why is that? Well, because he did not want to upset these border states and give these border states any reason to leave the Union. So these border states were seen as critical and very important and affected policy a great deal. Abraham Lincoln's policy a great deal through early on in the war, but also throughout the war. All right, so the Battle of Fort Sumter, it's kind of not really much of a battle. It's more of a siege or a bombardment of Fort Sumter. So at the beginning of the Civil War, or the beginning of the Confederacy, the early days, as these states like South Carolina and the other states that secede, there's United States Army bases and forts all over the South. And so these southern states, as they secede from the Union, they begin trying to basically take control of each of these forts and therefore, get the ammunition and the supplies that are there and then make those their own forts. And they're successful at that in many places. Those that are loyal to the Union have to kind of escape almost back north in many cases. But at Fort Sumter, they've held hold of it. They've kept hold of it there at Fort Sumter. And the southern state, South Carolina, says, you know what, we're not going to let them stay there. And so they surround it. They begin bombarding it. And eventually, no supplies are getting in, and so they have to surrender. Otherwise, they eventually will either starve or be defeated. And so Fort Sumter is surrendered on April 14th of 1861, and that's kind of the beginning of armed conflict between the United States and the Confederate States. And on the next slide, we'll see a map, kind of, so you have an idea of where Fort Sumter was. And so here you can see that it's right out in the middle of a waterway there, kind of surrounded by all these Confederate bombardment points where they can bombard the fort and really stop any vessels from coming in or out to supply Fort Sumter. And now we're going to talk about the first Battle of Bull Run. And this is really important because it's the first major battle. It's July 21st, 1861. There's about 18,000 troops engaged in the battle on each side, so about 18,000 for the Union, about 18,000 for the Confederates. And they both have more than that, but only about 18,000 are fighting. But that's a huge number of combatants on each side. But on both sides, they're very poorly trained, not really prepared for battle. And both sides think this battle, they're going to win this battle and the war's going to be over and everything will be all right. Well, the Union is slow to move. They do attack. It is a disaster. The Confederates actually start to have some trouble. They're suffering, but they kind of rally their troops. The Union is kind of slow to take advantage of the advantage they've gained, and therefore the Confederates are able to rally themselves, and then the Union has to retreat, and it's a very disorganized retreat and just a mess. And it's the first major battle, lot more casualties than anybody expected, and after this, both sides realize this war will not end quickly, and it's going to be much more. It's going to be much bloodier and difficult than anybody really expected. And then here we have the Battle of Fredericksburg, and this takes place in 1862. So this is a little later into the war, but it is a A great example just of kind of the trouble that the Union is having. The Union really does have a hard time with getting many meaningful victories. The Union goal was to attack and get to Richmond, Virginia, and capture the capital and maybe end this war quickly. And Lincoln is trying to get his generals to attack and move quickly, and he can't get McClellan to move quickly, who's the first commander of the Army of the Potomac, and so Ambrose Burnside is put in charge, and he says, Burnside, you need to get there, and you need to take care of business, and he does. He tries, but because of other delays and things like that, they don't get the pontoon bridges that they need to cross the Rappahannock River to get across into Fredericksburg and then on to Richmond. And so because of that slowing them down, Robert E. Lee is able to get to Fredericksburg and get to the high points. And so you can see here in this map, Marie's Heights here, and each of these point positions, these are high points. And so for the Union to break through those lines, they're going to have to go up across these fields and go uphill, and it's going to be very difficult. And this is just a completely devastating defeat for the Union. They have more than twice as many casualties killed, wounded, and missing. So that's what casualties means, killed, wounded, and missing. So there's over 12,000 killed, wounded, and missing for the Union, and less than 6,000 for the Confederates. Most of the worst of it is here at Marie's Heights, where Burnside sends his forces up that hill, and it's across a open field, and the Confederates are behind a stone wall, and they are able just fire at them as they cross this hill, and it's just massacring them. And so it's a terrible defeat for the Union. They see that they're not going to get to Richmond, and that's just kind of a good sampling of what it was like in the early days for the Union in trying to accomplish their goals, especially in the Eastern Theater of the war. So that's it. That's the beginning of the war. Those are some of the key battles for the beginning of the war, and it also tells us about the border states. So make sure you do the questions that are right below this video next.